A final goodbye. The funeral home was silent except for the occasional whisper of condolences and the soft rustle of fabric as mourners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut lilies and roses, mingling with the faint traces of candle wax. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, one that carried the weight of grief, an absence louder than any sound. Elena sat in the front row, her hands gripping the hem of her black dress, her fingers trembling slightly. Her chest felt tight, like a hand was pressing down on it, making it harder to breathe. Her mother, Margaret Holloway, lay in the polished mahogany coffin, dressed in the navy blue gown she had worn on countless special occasions. The dress complemented her soft features, the kind smile that had graced so many lives, now frozen in eternal stillness. Her hands were folded neatly over her stomach, her wedding ring still on her finger, a symbol of a love that had endured decades. Elena couldn't believe she was really gone. Just a week ago, her mother had been bustling around the kitchen, humming an old tune, teasing Elena about her terrible coffee-making skills. Now that warmth was gone, replaced by the cold, hard truth of death. Her father, James, sat beside her, his eyes hollow and rimmed with exhaustion. He hadn't spoken much since Margaret passed. Grief had settled into him like a ghost, making him quieter, more distant. Elena wasn't sure how to reach him anymore. Across the room, distant relatives whispered to one another, exchanging sympathetic glances. Friends of the family offered hushed condolences. The preacher, an elderly man with kind but tired eyes, stood before the gathering, speaking softly about Margaret's life, her kindness, her strength, the love she had given so freely. But Elena barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere, drowning in memories. Her mother laughing as they baked cookies on a rainy afternoon, the warmth of her arms after a bad day, the way she would always know exactly what to say. And now, there was only silence. Her younger brother, Oliver, nudged her gently. "It's time," he whispered. Elena sucked in a shaky breath and stood. Her legs felt weak as she stepped toward the coffin. The room blurred around her, but she forced herself forward. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silvered phone, her mother's old smartphone. It had a few scratches along the edges, a worn-out case with tiny floral designs peeling at the corners. Margaret had loved that phone, even though Elena had tried to convince her to get a newer model. "This one still works just fine," her mother had said, smiling. "Besides, what's the rush? As long as I can call you, that's all that matters." Elena swallowed hard as she held the phone in her hands. Her mother had used this phone to check in on her every day, to send little text messages that simply said, "Thinking of you." And now, Elena would never get another message from her again. The pain was unbearable. She hesitated, then carefully placed the phone inside the coffin, next to her mother's still hands. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Just in case you need to call." Her father shot her a confused glance but didn't question it. Perhaps he understood in some way. Elena wiped away a tear before it could fall and stepped back. The coffin was closed moments later, the lid sealing shut with a quiet finality that sent a shiver through her. The weight of it hit her all at once. This was real. There was no waking up from this. She watched as the coffin was lowered into the ground, surrounded by the soft murmur of prayers. The sky was overcast, a dull gray that seemed to mirror the emptiness inside her. One by one, people left, murmuring their final goodbyes before disappearing down the cemetery path. But Elena stayed. Even after the last of the dirt was placed over the grave, even after her father squeezed her shoulder and told her they should head home. She wasn't ready to leave yet. Instead, she pulled out her own phone, staring at her mother's contact name one last time. "Mom." Her thumb hovered over the screen. It was ridiculous, she knew that. But something inside her ached for one last connection. So she did it. She pressed call. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Then straight to voicemail. "Hey, Mom," she said softly, her voice cracking. "I know you're not there. She swallowed. I just miss you." The wind rustled through the cemetery, cold against her skin. Elena sighed and hung up. She turned to leave, but as she took a step forward, her phone buzzed in her hand. Her heart nearly stopped. One new notification. Missed call. Mom. The breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the screen, unable to move. The call had lasted 4 seconds. She hadn't imagined it. The phone buzzed again. A new message. From her mother's number. Don't answer. Elena's blood ran cold. Her grip tightened around the phone as her pulse pounded in her ears. She spun around, staring at her mother's grave. The dirt was freshly packed. Nothing was disturbed. But deep inside the earth, beneath the weight of soil, beneath the coffin's heavy lid, a phone had just rung. And something, had answered the call from the grave. The wind howled through the cemetery, rustling the branches of the old oak trees that stood like silent sentinels around the graves. Elena's fingers clenched around her phone, her knuckles turning white. She stared at the screen, her breath shallow. Missed call. Mom. Her mother's number. That wasn't possible. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs, every beat echoing in her ears. Her legs felt frozen in place, her brain unable to process what she had just seen. "It's a glitch," she whispered to herself, though her voice trembled. "A network error. Maybe someone hacked her number." Right. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. Then, another vibration. New message from Mom. Elena hesitated. Her entire body felt like it was screaming, "Don't look, don't look," but her fingers moved before she could stop them. She tapped the notification. The message was short, simple, and chilling. "Don't answer." Elena's breath hitched. Her chest tightened with a feeling she couldn't explain. Dread slithered into her stomach, cold and heavy. She looked up, her eyes darting toward her mother's grave. The dirt was still fresh, the headstone polished and unmarked except for the small plaque that would later bear her mother's name. Nothing looked out of place. And yet, a terrifying thought clawed at the edges of her mind. What if the phone was ringing from inside the coffin? No, that was insane. She had seen them close the coffin, had watched the burial. There was no way. Unless. Elena shook her head. She had to leave. She needed sleep. The funeral, the grief, it was all messing with her mind. Clutching her coat tighter around her body, she turned on her heel and started walking toward the cemetery exit. Her father and brother had already left, assuming she wanted some time alone. She had just stepped onto the cracked stone path when... Ring, ring, ring. Elena froze. Her phone screen lit up. Incoming call. Mom. Her blood turned to ice. The phone vibrated in her trembling hands, the name flashing on the screen like a beacon of horror. Mom was calling. But that wasn't possible. Elena could barely breathe. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to reject the call, to throw the phone away, to run. But her thumb moved on its own. She answered. Hello. For a moment, nothing. Only silence. Then, a sound. Not a voice. Not words. But scraping. A slow, deliberate scratching noise, like nails against wood. Elena's stomach lurched. She clapped a hand over her mouth, suppressing a gasp. The sound grew louder, more desperate. A sickening thought slithered into her mind. It sounds like something trying to get out. Then, finally, a voice. Low, hoarse, barely above a whisper. Elena, help me. Elena's entire body locked up. Her mother's voice. It was her, but it was wrong. Weak, faint, like it was coming from underground. Elena. The voice rasped again. It's so dark. I can't breathe. Elena's vision blurred. Her hands were shaking so violently, she almost dropped the phone. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Mom, she whispered. The scraping grew frantic, desperate. Elena, please, please, let me out. Tears welled in her eyes. Her chest ached with confusion, terror, and something even worse. Hope. Her mother was dead. She had seen her body, touched her cold hands. But the voice on the phone sounded so real, so agonizingly familiar. Could they have made a mistake? The thought hit her like a sledgehammer. What if she's still alive? Elena stumbled backward, her breathing ragged. Her mother had been declared dead after collapsing suddenly. The doctor said it was a brain aneurysm. But what if? What if she had been in some kind of coma? What if she had been buried alive? The very idea made her want to scream. No, she choked out, gripping her head. No, this isn't happening. This isn't real. Elena, the voice on the phone whimpered. I don't want to be alone. A sob tore from Elena's throat. She didn't think. She turned and ran. Her legs carried her faster than she thought possible, past rows of tombstones, past the rusted cemetery gate. She practically threw herself into her car, fumbling with the keys. She had to get to the funeral home. Now, the moment the engine roared to life, she peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching against the pavement. Her mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of panic. She had to dig up the grave, had to find out the truth. If there was even the slightest chance, even one tiny chance, that her mother was alive down there. She had to know. But just as she reached the main road, her phone buzzed again. Another message. Elena's hands shook as she glanced down. Don't come back. Her stomach twisted into knots, her vision blurred with fear and confusion. Then, another message. It's not her. The car veered slightly as she gasped. Her grip tightened on the wheel. The phone buzzed again, the final message making her blood freeze. Whatever you do, do not open the coffin. Elena's breath hitched, her hands slick with sweat. She stared at the message, her entire body trembling. If it's not her, then who is calling me? Or worse, what is calling me? But no matter how much fear clawed at her heart, she knew one thing for certain. She had to find out. No matter what waited for her in that coffin. The graveyard truth. The road ahead was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of Elena's headlights cutting through the thick fog that had settled over the night. Her hands trembled against the steering wheel, her breath uneven. She couldn't shake the eerie messages. Don't come back. It's not her. Whatever you do, do not open the coffin. Her mother had been dead for 2 days. She had seen her body, cold and lifeless, in the casket. And yet, she had just spoken to her, or something that sounded like her. Elena's heart pounded as she pushed the accelerator, the speedometer creeping higher. She had to know the truth. The cemetery was only 10 minutes away, but every second felt like an eternity. The wind howled outside, shaking the trees that lined the road. She swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter. Then her phone buzzed again. Her stomach twisted as she glanced at the screen. Incoming call. Mom. She sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers tightening until her knuckles turned white. No, no, no. It was impossible, but there it was. The same name, the same ringtone, the same horrifying reality. Her thumb hovered over the decline button. But before she could press it, the call connected. Elena hadn't touched the screen. The call had answered itself. Her breath hitched. Hello, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, only silence. Then, a slow, deliberate breath. And then, Elena, her mother's voice, hoarse, faint, wrong. The car swerved as Elena instinctively yanked the wheel, trying to steady herself. Mom, she choked out. Elena, please, help me. The voice was barely above a whisper, but there was something off. Something unnatural in the way the words dragged out. Tears burned her eyes. It sounded so real. Where are you? She asked, her voice shaking. A pause. Then a ragged breath. Inside. The air in Elena's lungs turned to ice. Inside where? Inside what? She managed to whisper, "Silence." And then, the coffin. Alina's breath left her body in a violent gasp. Her hands trembled against the wheel as the cemetery gates loomed in the distance. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. But it was, and she was about to find out why. The cemetery at midnight. Alina killed the engine and stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady beneath her. The graveyard stretched before her, tombstones casting long, eerie shadows under the dim moonlight. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and decaying flowers. The silence was deafening. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, her breath misting in the cold night air. Her mother's grave was near the center of the cemetery. The fresh dirt was still packed tightly over the burial site, untouched. But something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like the grave itself was breathing. Alina hesitated, her fingers trembling as she pulled out her phone. She hesitated before dialing the number. Her mother's number. The line rang. Once. Twice. Then, a vibration. Not from her phone. From beneath her feet. Alina's blood turned to ice. The vibration was coming from the grave. The ringing sound was muffled, distant, but it was coming from underground. She staggered backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. No, this wasn't happening. Her knees buckled as she collapsed onto the dirt, her hands trembling violently. What if she had been buried alive? What if the doctors had been wrong? What if her mother was still alive right now, suffocating in that coffin, desperately trying to call for help? Tears blurred her vision. She had to dig. She had to get her mother out. She scrambled to her feet, looking around for something, anything that could help her. She spotted a rusted shovel leaning against the cemetery's tool shed and lunged for it. With shaking hands, she plunged the blade into the dirt. The soil was loose, freshly turned, but still heavy. She dug furiously, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of the earth pushed back against her, resisting her frantic efforts. Her muscles burned, sweat trickling down her forehead despite the cold. The phone kept ringing. Mom calling. Each vibration felt like a death knell. She kept digging, her fingers blistering, dirt caking her nails. Finally, her shovel hit something hard. The coffin. A choked sob escaped her lips. She wiped her hands on her jeans, gripping the edges of the wooden lid. Her breath hitched. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached for the latch. Whatever you do not open the coffin. The message flashed in her mind like a warning bell. Alina's fingers froze over the handle. She swallowed hard, heart hammering against her ribs. And then, the coffin moved. A single, violent jerk. Alina screamed and stumbled backward. The wooden lid shuddered again, like something inside was trying to get out. She couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed at her to run. Then, the phone stopped ringing. Silence. Stillness. Alina's pulse pounded in her ears. Then, a sound. Knocking. Slow. Rhythmic. From inside the coffin. Tears spilled down her cheeks. This wasn't normal. This wasn't human. Whatever was in that coffin, it wasn't her mother. Alina's hands trembled violently as she scrambled backward. And then, for the first time, the coffin spoke. Alina. She froze. Her mother's voice, but not her mother's voice. It was distorted, wrong, like something was mimicking it. Let me out. Her blood turned to ice. A chill ran down her spine so sharp it felt like a knife. She knew, she just knew, that if she opened that coffin, she would never leave this graveyard alive. Alina took a shuddering breath. And then, she ran. She sprinted through the cemetery, the night air cutting against her skin, her heart pounding so violently it hurt. Behind her, the knocking grew louder, faster, more desperate. Alina. She didn't look back. She reached her car, fumbling with the keys, her hands slick with sweat. She threw herself inside and slammed the door, locking it. The cemetery was silent. The knocking had stopped. Elena's breath came in ragged gasps. Her phone buzzed one final time. A message. With trembling fingers, she glanced at the screen. One last text. "You should have opened it," Elena screamed. And in the rearview mirror, she saw something standing behind her. The thing in the mirror. Elena's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, her chest rising and falling in uneven, frantic rhythms. But none of that compared to what she saw in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing right behind her car. Its shape was distorted by the darkness, but the outline was unmistakable. A person. A person who shouldn't be there. A person who should be 6 feet under. Elena's blood ran cold. She couldn't turn around. She couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed at her to move, to do something, anything, but she was frozen in place, caught between logic and horror. The shadowy figure did not move. It just stood there, watching her. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to look closer. The thing in the mirror, it had her mother's face. But it was wrong. Her mother's eyes were hollow, dark voids where life should have been. Her skin was too pale, too smooth, too unnatural. And her mouth, it was smiling. A slow, stretched grin, too wide for a human face. Elena's stomach twisted. This was not her mother. Tears blurred her vision as she reached for the ignition with shaking hands. She turned the key. Nothing. She turned it again. The engine sputtered. The figure in the mirror tilted its head, as if amused. Elena's heart pounded. Come on, she whimpered, frantically turning the key. The engine roared to life. She slammed her foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement as the car lurched forward, skidding slightly before catching traction. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But as she sped down the darkened road, something inside her told her. It was still watching. A warning too late. Elena didn't stop driving until she reached her apartment. Her hands were still shaking as she fumbled with her keys. She shoved the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her and locking every bolt. She leaned against the door, pressing her forehead to the cool wood, struggling to catch her breath. Her phone buzzed. She flinched. Her trembling fingers hesitated before picking it up. Another message. From the unknown number. You shouldn't have run. Elena's body stiffened. Her breath hitched as she slowly lowered the phone. A shadow flickered in her peripheral vision. She whipped her head toward the window. Nothing. Just the empty city street, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. She was safe, or so she thought. The phone buzzed again. Another text. Look in the mirror. Her stomach twisted. Slowly, cautiously, she turned her head toward the hallway mirror. At first, she only saw her own reflection, wide-eyed, pale, disheveled. And then, it blinked. But she hadn't. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as the reflection tilted its head, just like the thing in the cemetery. No, no, no. Elena stumbled backward, her pulse roaring in her ears. The reflection stepped forward. But she hadn't moved. Her lungs squeezed tight, her throat closing with fear. The thing in the mirror wasn't her. And then, it smiled. A slow, eerie grin, just like the thing in the graveyard. Elena scrambled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she tried to dial a number, any number. But the screen glitched. The reflection's mouth moved. And her phone buzzed again. Another message. Let me in. Elena screamed. The mirror shattered. Shards of glass exploded across the floor as she stumbled back, barely avoiding the falling fragments. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at the broken pieces. For a brief, horrifying moment, she saw something moving in the shards. Something that shouldn't be there. And then, silence. Elena's body trembled violently. What was happening? What had she done? Her phone buzzed one last time. With trembling fingers, she glanced at the screen. One final message. You can't run from family, Elena. You should have opened the coffin. Tears burned her eyes. What had she brought back? And more importantly, what did it want? The thing that answered the phone. Alina sat on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Her chest felt tight, her limbs frozen with fear. The room around her was deathly silent, yet the air felt charged, like a presence was watching her, waiting. Her phone, still clutched in her trembling hand, vibrated once more. Ring. She nearly dropped it. The screen flickered erratically. An incoming call from the same unknown number. Her blood turned to ice. She should ignore it. She should throw the phone away. But she couldn't move. The ringing continued, echoing in the small apartment. Each tone sent a shiver down her spine. And then, it stopped. Alina swallowed, staring at the phone screen. One new voicemail. Her fingers trembled as she hovered over the play button. Every part of her screamed, "Oh, listen." But something deeper, something darker, made her press it anyway. The recording crackled to life, static filling the room. At first, there was nothing. Then, a sound. A wet, ragged breath. A pause. Then a voice. Low, whispering, and wrong. Alina. She choked on air. That voice. It was her mother. But it wasn't. It was distorted, inhuman. "I see you." Alina's heart slammed against her ribs. "Why did you run?" She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle the scream rising in her throat. "You should have opened the coffin." A slow, inhuman laugh crackled through the speaker. It was deep, hollow, almost like it was coming from beneath the earth. And then, silence. The voicemail ended. Alina hurled the phone across the room. It struck the wall with a loud thud before landing on the floor. Screen cracked. Tears blurred her vision. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Her mother was gone. This thing wasn't her. But if that was true, then what had she been speaking to? Her gaze flickered toward the broken mirror. The pieces lay scattered across the wooden floor, each shard reflecting fragments of her face. And in one of them, her reflection was still smiling. Alina's blood turned to ice. She scrambled backward, her hands shaking as she forced herself to tear her eyes away. This wasn't happening. She needed help. She needed answers. And there was only one place she could get them. The cemetery. She had to go back. She had to open the coffin. The return to the grave. The night was cold. Alina wrapped her arms around herself as she made her way through the cemetery, the dim glow of her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows over the tombstones. Each step felt heavier, as if something unseen was trying to pull her back. The graveyard was silent. Too silent. There were no insects chirping, no rustling leaves, just emptiness. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with the scent of damp earth and dying flowers. Alina's stomach twisted. She reached the grave, her mother's final resting place. But something was wrong. The soil was disturbed. The dirt looked freshly dug. Like someone had already been here. Like someone had already opened it. A chill ran down her spine. Her heart pounded as she knelt, running her fingers over the loose earth. There were finger marks. Long, dragging finger marks. Like something had clawed its way out. Alina's breath hitched. Then, a sound. A faint, scratching noise. Coming from beneath her. Her stomach twisted violently. No. No. No, no. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the scratching grew louder. Something was under there. Something was awake. Alina stumbled backward, her hands flying to her mouth. Then, a whisper. "Alina." She screamed. The ground split open. The earth collapsed inward. And something crawled out. What comes from the grave? The thing that emerged wasn't her mother. At least, not anymore. Its skin was too pale. Its eyes were too black. Its mouth, too wide. It stood there, hunched, its thin, bony fingers curling and uncurling like it was getting used to moving again. Elena couldn't breathe. The thing tilted its head. And then it grinned. "You shouldn't have called me back." A sharp, bone-cracking noise filled the air as the figure lurched forward. Elena turned and ran. Branches whipped against her face as she sprinted toward the entrance, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. The thing was following her. She could hear it, a wet, unnatural sound of bones popping and joints bending in ways they shouldn't. But she didn't look back. She couldn't. She reached the cemetery gates and shoved through them. Her foot caught on a root. She tripped. She hit the ground hard, her palms scraping against the gravel. Behind her, the thing stopped. It stood at the entrance, staring at her, its head twisted unnaturally to the side. Then, it smiled. "See you soon, my love." And then, it sank into the ground, vanishing, like it had never been there at all. Elena's breath came in ragged gasps. Her mind raced. This wasn't over. It had never been about the phone. It had never been about contacting her mother. It had been waiting. And now it was free. The final goodbye. Elena sat curled up on her bed, wrapped in a blanket, her entire body trembling. The events of the past 24 hours replayed in her mind on a loop. Her mother's voice on the phone, the voicemail, the thing that crawled out of the grave. It hadn't been her mother. Her real mother was gone. But something else, something twisted, wrong, had taken her place. And now it was loose. A sharp knock at the door sent her heart slamming into her ribs. She sat up, breath hitching in her throat. No one should be here. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone, her fingers tightening around it. The screen was still cracked from when she had thrown it earlier, but the time glowed back at her. 3:07 a.m. The witching hour. The knock came again. Louder this time. More insistent. She sucked in a breath. Elena. She froze. That voice. It was coming from outside the door. Low. Whispering. Familiar. Her mother's voice. But she knew better now. She knew it wasn't her. "Elena, sweetheart, let me in. It's so cold out here." The voice was too soft, too calm. Like it was pretending. Elena clamped a hand over her mouth, biting down on the inside of her cheek to keep herself from making a sound. If she didn't answer, if she stayed quiet, maybe it would go away. Thud. She jumped. Something hit the door. Hard. Elena. The voice wasn't whispering anymore. It was closer. Harsher. "You don't love me anymore." Tears pricked her eyes. She squeezed them shut, pressing herself against the headboard. No. No. No, no. This wasn't her mother. It never had been. But the thing on the other side of the door wanted her to believe it was. Elena. A long, sharp scraping sound ran down the length of the door. Like nails. She couldn't breathe. Then, silence. Elena sat frozen, heart hammering. The only sound in the room her own ragged breaths. Had it gone? She listened. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then, a whisper. So faint. So soft. Right behind her ear. "I found you." A cold, skeletal hand slid over her shoulder. She screamed. The ritual of severance. Elena threw herself forward, tumbling off the bed and landing hard on the floor. Her shoulder throbbed where the thing had touched her, an icy burn spreading through her skin. She scrambled to her feet, spinning around. The room was empty, but the shadows in the corners looked darker, like they were watching, like they were waiting. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She flinched. The screen lit up. Another voicemail. Her hands trembled as she hovered over the play button. She knew she shouldn't. She knew it was a trap. But she pressed it anyway. A rush of static. Then, a voice. Not her mother's. Something else. Something older. She was never meant to leave. The air in the room shifted. A cold, heavy presence settled over her, pressing against her chest. You called her back. Tears burned down her cheeks. You brought her to the space in between. Alina shook her head violently. No, I didn't mean to. You have to finish it. The phone cut off. And then, she knew. There was only one way to end this. She had to sever the connection. She had to return what should have stayed buried. The final confrontation. The cemetery was silent when she arrived. No wind, no rustling trees. Just an eerie, waiting stillness. Alina held a small silver knife in her shaking hands, its surface glinting under the moonlight. It wasn't just a knife. It was her mother's, a family heirloom, something that had been passed down through generations, a blade meant to protect. She approached the disturbed grave, her breath forming white puffs in the cold night air. The earth was still loose, like something had crawled out and could crawl back in. She stepped forward. A movement, just at the edge of her vision. Alina's blood ran cold. The thing stood at the other side of the grave. It looked like her mother, but it wasn't. Its body was too thin, its face too hollow, and its smile too wide. Alina, it whispered, stretching out a bony hand. Come home with me. Tears welled in her eyes. For a moment, just a moment, she almost believed it. But then, its eyes changed. They went completely black, like an endless void. And she knew. This thing had never been her mother. It was a parasite, something that lived in the spaces between life and death, something that fed on the love of the grieving. And she had let it in, but she could end it. Now, Alina gripped the knife, her mother's blade, the one thing that still carried her real mother's presence. She lunged. The creature's smile twisted into a snarl. It shrieked, inhuman and furious, as the blade sank into its chest. Its skin rippled, its form warping. It wasn't her mother anymore. It was a writhing, shadowy mass, its long fingers clawing at the blade as black, oozing liquid spilled from the wound. Alina twisted the knife deeper. You're not her, she whispered. The thing screamed. And then, it collapsed into itself. The earth beneath it opened, swallowing it whole. The air was suddenly lighter. The cemetery silent once more. Alina collapsed to her knees, gasping, the knife still clenched in her trembling hands. And as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, she finally knew. Her mother was at peace, and the thing that had answered the phone would never come back again. Epilogue. The final call. A week later, Alina sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, the weight in her chest finally lighter. Her phone vibrated beside her. She glanced at it, expecting another spam call. But her breath caught in her throat. It was an unknown number. Her hands clenched around the mug. And then, she let it ring. She let it go to voicemail. And this time, she never listened.